Welcome to This Week in Podcasting, where we discuss this week's most exciting podcasting news and tips, all in under 10 minutes. Episode 23 is provided by Sounder.fm, the smarter way to podcast. Let's get started. This week, we cover what really happens in podcast Facebook groups, how young Middle Easterners are taking media into their own hands, true crime podcasts ranked by state, why you need a podcast survey, and the estimated growth of podcast listeners by 2023. First up, the power of podcast Facebook groups. Listening to a podcast is usually an isolated activity, something we do alone on the way to work, at the gym, or while cleaning the house. And since we spend so much time alone with our favorite voices, it's easy to fill up with thoughts, ideas, and questions in response. That's why listeners have taken to Facebook groups. These little communities tucked all over Facebook allow listeners to finally talk about the show they spend hours listening to. Sometimes the conversation takes a pretty magical turn. Instead, members get sidetracked and end up on tangents, talking about their failed marriages, sharing parenting advice, and helping each other pick out outfits for first dates, writes New York Times journalist Taylor Lorenz. It seems like listeners join podcast Facebook groups to talk about the show, but end up staying for the like-minded community. Do you belong to a podcast Facebook group? Do you have one for your show? Next, we love podcast listener metrics. Why? Because they keep growing. Analysts at eMarketer estimate 78.9 million Americans will listen to a podcast in 2020. That's 2.5 million more than consumed on-demand programming last year, writes Inside Radio. By 2023, eMarketer projects U.S. podcast listeners will total 85.4 million. Nearly 4 in 10 digital audio listeners will be consuming podcasts alongside audiobooks and radio. For all those podcast creators working until the wee hours of the morning, here's your affirmation. People are listening. Moving on, Castle Systems maps out the most popular crime podcasts in the U.S. by state based on Google search interest. How fun! Generation Y ranks 1 in 7 states, the most of any podcast. Morbid, Dr. Death, Root of Evil, and Dirty John follow, writes Lynn Leahay of Synopsis Media. Surprisingly, Serial only shows up twice, even though it broke download records. Sounder's team is worldwide, but soon will have headquarters in New York City, which, according to this data, listens to a lot of Killer Queen. Dying to know your state's favorite true crime podcast? Check out the link in our show notes. Next up, young Middle Easterners are tired of listening to mainstream media aimed at their parents. Instead, they're taking matters into their own hands by producing podcasts they can see themselves in. Although the podcast scene in the Middle East is still maturing, listeners can now hear shows on an array of topics, such as long-form narratives about relationships, the body and the self, and the concept of statelessness, or simply listen to a couple of Saudi guys engaging in a roundtable discussion about cartoons, writes Megan Giovanetti for AL Monitor. Creators are taking advantage of the freedom podcasting provides by discussing different perspectives on news and politics. Amar Saban, co-founder of the Jeddah-based production network MS Tedford, says, "What we like about podcasting is that it allows us to do whatever we want and say almost whatever we want. It's liberating for us. There are currently some 1,000 Arabic language podcasts produced in the Middle East today." Random podcasting tip of the week: survey your audience. Audience surveys empower podcasters to make better shows, earn more money, and build stronger relationships with listeners, writes Fellow Collective's Amanda McLaughlin. Why? Knowing your listeners' demographics, habits, and interests can help you figure out where to book live shows and refine your release schedule. You can ask for feedback on your content and learn what listeners want more of. This process not only builds trust with your audience, but it also garners vital information to present when speaking to potential sponsors. When writing your survey, front-load crucial questions because, quote, some people may drop off in the middle of the survey, unquote. Google Forms is a great free survey resource. For more tips, check out Amanda's piece in our show notes. That's all Sounder has for you this week. Keep on creating.